Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise, Ghost in the Machine. Today we have Rob Simon, who is here to discuss really hardware testing and what a hardware security engagement looks like, and perhaps if you need to do one. Before we begin, I do want to mention our Discord server. That is discord.gg/TrustedSec if you want to join. You can talk about this show, and if you have any suggestions, ideas, or even want to be a guest, let us know. I do have one news item. OpenBSD 7.6 has been released if you're into that sort of thing. Lots of new support for various ARM SOC-C systems. So if you are looking at building an embedded project or something like that, maybe worth checking out if you feel like going beyond the usual Linux. There's definitely been some other virtualization enhancements and other interesting feature adds there too. So if you haven't played in the BSD world in a while, give it a look. All right, with that, we will go ahead and introduce Rob, or at least let Rob introduce himself. Rob, why don't you tell us who you are and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis, especially with regard to hardware security assessments.
Sure. So I'm the practice lead here at TrustedSec over hardware and mobile security. So we do a lot of engagements with hardware devices, mobile devices, and especially ones where hardware and mobile interact. So a lot of cool stuff, but looking forward to chatting about it today. So thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Well, let me kind of start the conversation off with, tell folks a little bit about what actually a hardware assessment is. I mean, are we, talking about hitting something with a hammer here? Are you taking the caps off of chips, or what does it generally look like?
It's funny that you actually say that because I literally had a client tell me that I could bang on something with a with a hammer. So I mean, it very well could be just banging on something with a hammer in terms of trying to get to something and steal something. But for the most part, there's like a wide variety of things we can do, and it's really just if you don't know, it's worth to have a conversation just to see what capabilities are. But a lot of hardware devices, it really depends on the goals too, or like what you're concerned about, what the hardware is and what it does. But a lot of devices, they have an initial pairing with a mobile device, and then they connect up to the cloud, and then you can kind of control them remotely. So think like your garage door openers are now controlled by an app anymore. You've got also the Nest, all sorts of devices that are in your home that you kind of remotely control now. So there's a lot of hardware assessments we see that are around that, and the focus is on looking at the communication, with those devices and with the back end and with the initial pairing. But then there's also things they might not necessarily connect to the cloud, but it might be concerns about intellectual property and whether or not modified firmware can be installed on the device because the device needs to be, say, like highly secured and not modified or not messed with. Thinking like maybe medical devices or things like that, where you really just don't want someone to be able to tamper with that or change how those things function. So it really does vary on what the device is and what the goals are, but there's a lot of cool stuff, a lot of things that we can do for kind of any of those areas too.
Okay, well, that's a nice introduction to the topic. I guess one of the things that, I'd kind of like to discuss is exactly who should be looking at a hardware assessment. Again, we've gotten kind of outside the realm of traditional pen tests. This has been a topic on the show recently, branching out into some of these other types of security assessments and stuff that, maybe get a little bit beyond responder and Metasploit and things of that nature. So with that in mind, who's the target for a hardware assessment? Is it somebody who's developing a first party, hardware product, be it an IoT light bulb or something like that? Is it an end user who's maybe deploying IoT products? Somebody in between, a supplier?
Yeah, I mean, it really can be anyone. I mean, especially if you're developing products that are going to be sold and, used by end consumers, it's definitely probably of interest to have an assessment against that, especially if it's going to be sitting in a user's home, collecting their Wi-Fi credentials, connecting to the network. So, having an assessment done on something like that. But we also have people come to us that have devices that they're going to be using or setting up within their corporate environments that are going to be sitting there. So they want to know, what does this thing do? Can it be used as a pivot point in our networks? They see a lot of IoT weaknesses and issues being exploited, and so that becomes a concern that they're going to be putting something on their network and they don't know what it does. They don't know if there's any hidden functionality or remote, phone home functionality or anything like that in there. So they just want to know, how secure is this thing going to be on our network? What is it going to be doing?
So does the IoT assessment typically include, when you get into the communications piece, what the network requirements are? For instance, would you be looking at, is the device using broadcasts? Is it, doing unicast IP, things like that, that may have some bearing on the deployment strategy from an architectural standpoint? Or is it more looking for direct security vulnerabilities?
I mean, we try to get a good understanding of what's going on, and it really just depends again on the device, right? So if it does have a network interface, we will see what's going on. So what's coming out of the device, what is it trying to communicate to or with, also what services does it expose, and what's on there. So we try to take that from the perspective of looking at vulnerabilities that are on the device usually, but also again, if there's any risk or threat that might pose to the environment that it's placed in, based on maybe like unknown traffic or something that's coming out of it, again like the phone home type stuff. But for the most part, I typically am focused on looking for vulnerabilities in the devices, but it really, again, it comes down to the client and what they're looking for, right, when we're looking at these things and what the end goal is.
So if I'm looking for someone to do an assessment for me, Rob, what are some of the tools that maybe I would think they should be talking to me about, or I would expect them to have in order to do some of this stuff?
Yeah, so a hardware assessment, again, can be such a wide variety of devices. That can be something as low level as looking at the chips on the device and the security of those chips, how those things are protected and the firmware that's on those. But it could also be a little bit of a higher level assessment where we're not so focused on that low of a level, and it's kind of more of like a kiosk breakout style of assessment where maybe we're looking at something like an ATM where really it's just a big computer with a lot of things connected to it, and we're kind of more focused on looking at the operating system level, gaining access to the underlying operating system, and then being able to access things from the devices like say card numbers or cash coming out of the dispensers, right? So there's multiple approaches and it really depends on the device. But talking about some of the tools or techniques that we would use, I would say, first you probably want to make sure that you understand what it is you're looking at and the goals, and then that kind of drives what tools, processes, and techniques you're using. There's a wide variety of things to use. So, if we're doing testing against devices that pair with mobile devices, they may be using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and we have, a bunch of tools that we can use for different protocols like that or different communications like that. We use like, this is a Wi-Fi pineapple. It's not the only thing we can use for testing Wi-Fi, but that's one thing we'll try to do, is see if we can't get the device connecting through something like a malicious hotspot or a malicious access point where we can kind of control the traffic and try to proxy it to look and see what's going on. So we'll hop on the same network with the device and look at it to see what services are open, and then we'll see, we'll kind of sniff with Wireshark for anything that we can't proxy and just see if there's any plain text protocols there. If we're looking at something at more like even lower level on the hardware side, we have this logic analyzers are another tool that we can use. Or another thing I have here is called a Hydra bus, which is very similar to a bus pirate if you're familiar with those. And these can be used for, if we get into the low level, sniffing communication buses between chips on a device, between MCUs or flash chips or things like that. So we can look at that. And then if they expose like serial ports or things like that, those are some tools that we can use, like the Hydra bus or the bus pirate, for connecting to those serial ports and then getting maybe console access on devices. So there's a bunch of different stuff. Oh, another one that I had sitting here. So this is the HackRF PortaPack. There's also a non-PortaPack version, which really just works with the computer. This one has a screen and lets you do some stuff like mobile. But if you have devices that are doing just plain old radio frequency communication, maybe not necessarily just Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, that's another thing we can try to look at, is just what unknown signals are being sent out of those, and if we can kind of figure out what's going on there, if it's sending anything in the clear over those signals as well.
So I think, from a network perspective, I know, we've seen different things happen. There's been stories about the, coffee maker that calls home, but lets somebody pivot into the network that way, and suddenly they're on your internal client LAN. And so I think the network engineers in the corporate world, for the most part, have probably taken the steps to begin to isolate some of these devices and things like that, whether it's on some sort of controls network that's separate from the LANs that the PCs are on. And so there's been some addressing of the kind of primary attack surface that way. But are there other concerns with IoT devices? I mean, certainly a lot of these things have cameras, they've got microphones, they may have security implications if they're a smart lock in terms of physical security. What are some of the things that you've seen and some of the stuff you've encountered as far as testing hardware that's kind of made the back of your hair and your neck stand up and things of that nature?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely there's devices where maybe you find vulnerabilities, but based on what the device is and what it does, it's not so concerning, or at least, for me specifically, it's not so concerning just because the device and what it does. But there's been things that I've looked at where they're home-based devices, they might have cameras and take picture or video, and then those go up into a cloud environment. And because of the way that those were configured, because of the keys, the access that was used in those situations, a user might be able to sniff their own traffic, see the security keys that are in use there, and then use them to access the backend cloud environment where they were able to see, say, everyone else's, data that's being sent. And if that's, in-home video or pictures or things like that, that becomes very concerning. So end users are always very concerned about that kind of stuff. They're always, a little bit cautious when you talk about cloud connected things with cameras and things like that in their homes. So those certainly are stuff that gets a lot more scrutiny. Certainly, clients that come to us with things that are like that, that's usually the concern there too. Is they don't want to end up in the news. They don't want to be the vendor that had unprotected client data exposed in the cloud because of some insecurity that they had with their devices.
So, with that being a concern, what are some of the things that you advise them to do to kind of better protect themselves from that?
Now, is this going to be for like the end users and consumers of like IoT products?
Yeah, I was gonna say more on like the IoT. So people who are concerned about like my lamp plug is listening to me, or phoning home to something like that. And what's some general like safety tips that you would give anybody?
Yeah, I mean, first, for one, I guess just be aware of the stuff that you're buying and putting in your home. It's becoming more and more prevalent that a lot of things are internet connected. Do they need to be, do you need to get something that's internet connected or not? But, definitely it's a convenience. I have a lot of internet connected things myself. So I guess, one thing you can do, it's becoming a little bit easier for end users. Some of these things, some of the things that you would do to try to protect yourself are going to be a little hard, but for end users, a lot of routers anymore have a very easy to set up like guest network, which is isolated from the rest of the network. If you're a little bit more tech savvy, you can try to, set up segmented networks where stuff that's on one network segment or one hotspot can't communicate to the devices on another hotspot. So that kind of helps with the concern about, I don't know what this thing is. It was made in another country, and I don't know if it's spying on my network traffic, kind of thing. So um, it's not a guaranteed or foolproof thing, but at least, having a little bit of isolation of your devices that are on the network. I know that's one thing that a lot of people do, or a lot of people here do that, when they get those devices, they'll put them on a segmented network. So, but that's usually easy enough with a more modern router that has that guest network capability where you can kind of isolate stuff.
Right. So let's move specifically to like a corporate environment. What are some maybe do's and don'ts for IoT in an office?
Yeah, absolutely. Segregation is definitely a must on things like that. So, I mean, there's no reason to put IoT connected devices within the corporate network if they don't need to be. So, definitely putting those on separate VLANs with rules and then monitoring those kind of things. There's lots of things that sometimes you just don't think about it though, and I get it. Sometimes it's easy enough to overlook that. You're kind of setting up a conference room and you're hooking up all the stuff that goes in there, and whatever reason, whatever the devices that are in there. Um, might have some kind of internet connected capabilities, and you just kind of plug them in and get everything set up and kind of forget to do stuff like that. But definitely isolating things like that on the network is probably one of the bigger things you can do.
You mentioned an example where you had a device that was posting some telemetry back to the cloud. It was a shared bucket or something of that nature, I gather. Do you find there's a lot of value in doing these kind of tests because it gives somebody with a more cross-disciplinary approach to things, an opportunity to look at a device, as opposed to maybe the hardware engineer who's, been designing the physical components, and the software engineer who are in another room and don't always talk to each other perhaps as much as they should. Have you found vulnerabilities that seem to specifically come out of, maybe some unexpected interactions and stuff there?
Yeah, we definitely do see that, and that is a good point, like you brought up. So, the cloud team might work in isolation from the hardware team, which might work in isolation from the mobile team, and they might have very little sharing of information that's going on other than, we need this thing to put stuff in this bucket, here's the key for it or something. Maybe the cloud team doesn't have a good understanding of exactly how the hardware is using that, or maybe the hardware team is asking for the wrong type of keys or access from the cloud team, and they're using it inappropriately. So, definitely uncovering stuff like that can help to spur those conversations between the teams as we go through, findings and reviews, and kind of discussing the right way, the remediations and what you should be doing. And that can kind of help on that front.
Okay. Skyler, it looked like you had something else you wanted to interject.
No, well, I have some fun questions too, and I wanted to know.
Oh, definitely. Got to get to those.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Let's get jiggy with it. So you have been. I understand. You've been able to do some stuff for some financial institutions. I believe at one point. Do you still have the ATM in your garage?
Yes, that is still there for now.
Have you gotten any cool findings from that?
I did, and I don't know that I should probably talk about the details of some of those things, but I will say that, when it gets hot and I have the door up and I'm working on things in there, sometimes I can get some looks as people walk by.
Yeah, you just got to tell us one thing. Did you get it to do the cash jackpot thing?
Yes.
Attaboy.
I've done that a while ago, and I definitely can say that I've seen things improve on that as well. So
that's also good. It's good to know they're locking that stuff down. What? So another one would be what's one of the coolest pieces of hardware that maybe like a client has sent you, and that if you can disclose that, what's some of the cooler, fun gadgets that you've had to work with?
Well, I've had some almost coolest things. The almost coolest thing, which we haven't got to do yet, would have been like an e-scooter type device where you pay for rides. That would have been amazing. I haven't got that yet, so that's still conversations that are in progress. But I would have loved to hop on an e-scooter and ride around around the neighborhood and be able to say that I'm doing that for work. So there's some cool things I've looked at more just in terms of because the work is interesting. So some of the medical devices that I've looked at, just me personally, I've enjoyed digging into the communication protocols, and then just some of the other things that are interesting for other reasons are just yeah, I've had home-based devices that you'd be able to tell other people what it is you're talking about, and they know, because they may have them in their home too. Being able to remotely access and control them, make them play music, and make them, move around or follow commands. So that was kind of a cool one for me, is to be able to look at something that a lot of people might have in their home and not realize you could take remote control of it.
Well, there you have it, folks. If your espresso machine starts playing the Westminster chimes and making you coffee at 2 p.m, you'll know why.
Rogue toasters.
Rob, an interesting kind of thought you mentioned the e-scooter to me was, a lot of gearheads have started to look at the electronic systems in cars, especially as, the EV stuff is starting to take off and things like that. Certainly you don't have the wiring loom that you used to. It's all CAN bus and stuff like that now. Are you seeing some crossover technologies from the automotive world starting to show up in personal area network type stuff, things like e-scooters, light bulbs, that type of thing? Or, is that somebody who maybe has some of those skills? Could they take that and move into doing some other types of hardware testing?
Sorry, maybe I don't know if I understand the question, but you're talking about looking at the CAN bus systems within cars, if that kind of applies into other areas?
or just whether it's CAN bus or other technologies that you're seeing, in the automotive space crossing over into some of these other devices.
Yeah, I would say I don't know maybe specifically about stuff from automotive crossing over, but I would say that I have seen some things. So I've done some testing, and I think it's technically probably would still consider it automotive, but CAN bus like things, but they're not in automobiles, right? It's still within it's vehicles, but it's more like commercial stuff. So it's forklifts or things like that. But I've seen things where like you have CAN buses hooked up to devices that are doing remote monitoring and sending them off to backend clouds, and those have been interesting things to look at. Looking at the device that connects to the cloud that has like a cellular connection as well as a Wi-Fi connection and then a CAN bus connection. So it's like a lot of interesting things to mix together, and then finding vulnerabilities and things like that where you have like say open access points and hard-coded known passwords that can be found out of diagnostic tools, getting you remote access onto a device's CAN bus from just driving by, a parking lot. So that's kind of like a really cool thing to look at. There's definitely other stuff in the automotive side that I wouldn't say it's driving other areas, but just things that you see in that side as maybe the automotive side is catching up.
Automotive
But
side
just
driving other areas. I see what you did there, Rob.
Yeah, I got that.
Just terrible.
But yeah, I've just like I started one of the side projects I've been messing with is messing around with the hack RF and looking at like say remote keyless entry into cars. There's like remote keyless entry. They also have PKE, they call it, or passive keyless entry. So just using there's the radio frequency communication that goes along in there. Then there's the cryptography or security that goes along with securing the commands that are being sent over the air to the automotive, like the BCM, which is basically one of the computers in the car that then picks that up and processes that information, and then that goes over the CAN bus. There's communication from there. So there's like a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and definitely like looking at the key side of it and looking at maybe the security around the codes and things that are being sent in the commands. Like that's something that you see similar like in other areas, right? With cryptography and stuff, and you might see that applied in other areas. Not that that's not coming out of the automotive industry or anything, but they're kind of catching up in terms of securing that stuff a little bit better.
Well, so there you go, folks. If you're a shade tree mechanic that's been dabbling in the electronics a bit lately, maybe you can take some of those skills and parlay them over into hardware security testing.
I got one more question for you, Rob.
Go ahead, Skyler.
All right. Because I know we're going to get asked about this, both in Discord and here. I'm actually at Wild West Hackin' Fest right now. So if you hear background noise, it's the conference. But have you messed with the Flipper Zero, sub gigahertz functionality and trying to like get into like mimic car fobs and garage doors? Because I know like at least here in the United States, the rolling codes are kind of like the killer of that type of hack.
Yeah, so I've gotten pretty low level into that, looking into it. So what I can say is that you can, if you look, I think on our blog or our website, we should have an article linked off of there too. Paul Sems, he was on the news not that long ago talking about car hacking stuff. So that's been a thing that was going around the news cycle lately. And so they spoke to Paul about that. And the Flipper Zero was obviously one of the areas of concern. So I think he had an older vehicle that he was able to actually clone the key signal and just replay it literally by just capturing the raw request and replaying. And that just happened to be because his car, the model car he was using, it's old enough that I don't think that even implemented a rolling code. It still had like the static code. So that's one thing to be aware of that people might not even know, is that you may have an older vehicle that's not even using rolling codes. It's could still be a static code, and just somebody capturing it can replay that signal, possibly even tamper the signal to change something. So maybe they captured a lock command. If they look at the signal, they might be able to figure out the unlock command and open the doors. Definitely the more interesting stuff though is like the newer systems with the rolling codes, and I have looked at that, and I know like me personally, I have been able, like the little project I've been messing with on the side for the specific vehicle I've been looking at, I have been able to look at the full, like, raw bytes that are being sent across. I've got a pretty good understanding of what all of that is. We can see the rolling code, I can see the count value, you can see the commands that are being sent to the car, and I have messed around with that a lot. But like one of the things with the Flipper that makes it a little bit harder is just because of the specific chipset that was used and because of the specific format of the data that I need to get put together to be able to send across the wire to say like generate a new signal, things there weren't kind of lining up to where it was easy to come up with a way to, like, for instance, one is like the preamble size. I needed a specific preamble size, and this is getting kind of technical, but the Flipper's chip only had like specific configurations to send stuff in, so it kind of made it a little bit difficult for me to use to do what I need to do. But it definitely works for other cool things, like, I mean, just being able to send raw noise signal on specific frequencies. So I've definitely used it in my car testing as a jammer for the signal, and just left it on my hood while I walk away to try to capture my key signal without the car hearing it, so it definitely has its uses there. And I've definitely used it in a lot of other assessments too. I've used it as like a rubber ducky stand-in for kind of automating kiosk breakout, keyboard escape sequences. So that's definitely a lifesaver rather than me plugging a keyboard in and manually pressing a bunch of shortcuts. So, it gets me a hit, and then I can kind of go back and check and see manually like which keyboard shortcut actually triggered something. But sorry, I kind of like veered off a lot, but
No, you're fine. That's what I'm seeing a lot here actually at the Wild West Hackin' Fest is a lot of Flipper Zeros.
I will say the Flipper Zero gets like a bad rap in the news, and I know with like the conversations about it in Canada and stuff. And I at least did want to say somewhere though that's it is a tool. It's not like a magic hacking device, right? And you can take that away, but there's many other tools that do the same thing. It definitely has its uses. And I mean, I even use it just like a fun toy, to be honest. It's nice to have as a universal remote control because of the IR stuff. I've definitely used it just to clone my Dave and Buster's card so my wife can do her thing and I can go do mine, and we get the same points on the same card, so we just save our tickets up on the same one. But yeah, but and it also has some uses and engagements where I've used it too. But it's definitely, I think it's an interesting conversation starter. It's definitely a way to get people into RF testing or RF security, just interest in RF that might not have had it before, just because of the package size. It's easy to use, it's user friendly, and it's definitely maybe a way for someone to get some understanding of that before moving on to maybe some more advanced things like SDR tools and stuff. But I do think it's important for people to get into that, though. There's got to be some way for people to kind of break into that, because it's not as easy as maybe some other areas. And if you're going to be developing things that are using RF, you should probably have a good understanding of that. What kind of security is around that, how easy it is to sniff that stuff out of the air.
Thanks.
All right, well, we are coming up on time here, so I want to thank our guest Rob for joining us today, and to say thank you all for watching and listening. Security Noise is a production of TrustedSec LLC. If you or your organization have questions or needs about information security, go to www.trustedsec.com. We'll see you next time.